Good evening, buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Welcome once again to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes, Manchester and Leeds. First of all, I would like to extend my warm welcome to our guest and coordinator of the series, Professor Kirsty Hooper, and to all of you to this second event on the series of Encuentro Spain, a series that has been thought and created by Professor Kirsty Hooper, and with which we would like to show Spain from the point of view of the travelers from Britain in the 20th and the 19th century, from a very different perspective of what is usually associated with Spain, especially from northern countries like Britain, with sunny beaches and sunny places, which we have, but we have many more things to show and to offer. And this is one of the main aims or goals of this series. In this sense, today we will speak. Professor Hooper will present Madrid from the perspective of the British travelers. But first of all, I will introduce her. Dr. Kirsty Hooper is Professor of Hispanic Studies at Warwick University and a specialist in Spanish, Anglo-Spanish, and Galician cultural histories in the 18th century. Her books include, among others, Writing Galicia into the World, Mondaris Vigo Santiago, A Brief Story of Galicia's Edwardian Touristic Boom, and the Edwardians and the Making of a Modern Obsession in 2020. She currently holds a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship for the project Hispanic London, Culture, Commerce and Community in the 19th century city. This project started in 2020 and will be finished next year, 2023. As I said, tonight we will discuss, after the lecture with Professor Hooper, about Madrid, a city that was once the seat of perhaps one of the most ambitious political enterprises in Western world, and a city where we can witness even today the presence and the past of the Roman Visigoths, and also the capital, as I said, the empire of Spain in the great times of our history. But this, with this history and a rich architecture of Madrid, it was not on the was not considered a highlight of the Victorian and Edwardian tourist itineraries. And with the lecture of Professor Kirsty Hooper, we will see that Madrid has so much to offer. And from these testimonies of the travelers, we will give this approach about the history, the great aesthetically offer of Madrid, and also that will serve us to travel or to imagine how is today Madrid, a city with great food, great nightlife, and with many more bars and bodegas and tapas scene than in many cities of Spain. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Kirsty, for this fantastic series. At the end of it, we will have like 15 minutes for questions and answers. You are very welcome to put your questions in the chat. And let me to remind you that our next lecture on the series will be about the Basque Country. We will inform you about the exact date at the beginning of the 2023 in our webpage and also through our Eventbrite site. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Kirsty. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for such a fantastic welcome. As we've just heard, today I'm going to be talking about Madrid through the eyes of British travellers, actually starting right at the end of the 18th century and coming all the way through to the beginning of the 20th. As you've just heard, I promised you a very positive British view of Madrid. And so now we're all going to have to be a little bit patient, because we will get to the very positive accounts, but not before we've heard from some earlier and far less polite ones. So we're going to visit Madrid today with a series of British writers, including Henry Swinburne at the end of the 18th century, Richard Ford and Henry O'Shea in the 19th century, and Albert Calvert, Sybil Fitzgerald and Letitia Higgin at the beginning of the 20th. So I hope you're all sitting comfortably, and I shall begin. Our first traveller, Henry Swinburne, visited Spain in 1775. He travelled from Perpignan, near his home in France, through Catalonia, along the Mediterranean coast to Gibraltar, then northwards via Toledo and Madrid to Castile and the Basque Country, re-entering France at Bayonne. 3 years later, in 1778, he published Travels Through Spain, a memoir with his own accompanying drawings, which became incredibly popular and remained in print for many years. And in fact, the picture that you can see behind me, if I just lean to one side, is Swinburne's view of Madrid from that same book. So Swinburne didn't especially enjoy his journey north from the Mediterranean coast to Madrid, writing to a friend from ugly and tedious beyond expression La Mancha, that, he said, for my part, unless it be to look out at a venta or to peep about for an adventure at the meeting of the crossroads, I intend sleeping all the way to Madrid. Unfortunately, he was no more impressed with Madrid when he finally reached it, writing, I do not imagine the most pitiful city in the peninsula can cut a more despicable figure than this metropolis of all the Spains does from the opposite hills as you approach it on the south side. Neither tree, villa, nor garden until you arrive at the avenues of the town. In short, the whole landscape round you is the barest and most melancholy I ever beheld. Once he got into the city, however, Swinburne was surprised to find that as soon as the trees of the walks shut out the prospect of the neighbouring country, the appearance of Madrid is grand and lively, noble streets, good houses, and excellent pavement, as clean as it once was dirty. After a brief stay in Aranjuez, where he was a guest of the Spanish court, Swinburne returned for a longer visit to Madrid. He spent his mornings combing through books and prints on the history of Spain, and his afternoons sightseeing in the city. His early positive impressions of the city appear to have dissipated somewhat on further acquaintance. He remarks that if you accept the royal palaces, there are few buildings worthy of attention, nor do I believe there is in Europe a capital that has so little to show as Madrid. The outward architecture of the city's churches, he writes, I think I may safely pronounce to be barbarous, and their manner of ornamenting the inside as bad as that of the worst ages. Swinburne's contempt for Madrid's vernacular churches, whose altars, he says, are piles of wooden ornaments heaped up to the ceiling and stuck full of wax lights, is in sharp contrast to his appreciation of the few examples of fine art he locates in the city's convents. In San Pasquale, for example, he notes a fine Titian, a capital Guercino, and many other pieces by esteemed Italian masters. Swinburne's preference for Italian high culture is likely the result not only of his extreme familiarity with it, but also of being hamstrung by an absence of critical and contextual tools for understanding Madrid's vernacular architecture and material culture. And his position is certainly influenced too by the strong anti-Catholic discourse still prevalent in late 18th century Britain. However, the overarching narrative Swinburne employs to explain what he sees in Madrid is the familiar narrative of Spain's mid-17th century decline that would have been all too familiar to his British readers. He attributes the barbarism of Madrid's churches to the fact that most were built or refurbished during what he calls a period in the history of Spain when all arts and sciences were fallen to the lowest ebb of depravement, the effect of the degeneracy of manners, the want of public spirit, and the disorder and weakness of a decaying monarchy. So Swinburne's vision of Madrid is framed by his reading of this decline. He dismisses the palatial homes of the city's great families as vast ranges of ugly fabrics, not distinguishable from the common houses in the streets, except by their larger dimensions, explaining them away as relics of the supine indifference that seized the Spaniards during the last 2/3 of the 17th century and near half of this. It does get better, I promise. Just as he did with the religious buildings, he searches Madrid's palaces for examples of Italian high culture. For example, he lauds the many precious monuments of antiquity in marble in the Palace of Medinaceli, the remains of a great collection brought from Italy by one of the Dukes of Alcalá. Just a couple of Spanish works by Murillo and Velázquez are deemed worthy of mention. In contrast, though, to the surviving relics of Bourbon decline, it's back. Swinburne highlights the modernizations carried out by Spain's current king, Carlos III, with whom he was personally acquainted, and boy, does he like to talk about that. He devotes many pages to the royal palace, built to replace the old one that had burned down in 1734, and therefore not tainted, at least in his view, by Spain's past. This isn't to say that he's uniformly positive about the building, which he considers clumsy and confused in the windows, pilasters, and ornaments, while the large glazed arches in the inner courts, he notes, are unpardonable for resembling the inside of a manufactory. However, this is all downstairs. With a wry note of self-reflection, Swinburne tells the reader that at the foot of the stairs, I shall leave all my spleen and prepare myself with unfeigned satisfaction to describe to you the beauty and grandeur of the upper apartments. I know no palace in Europe fitted up with so much true royal magnificence. He marvels at the king's extensive art collection, listing among his favourites paintings by Rubens, Van Dyck, Spagnolet, Mengs, Murillo and Velázquez, whose equestrian portrait of the Conde Duque Olivares, he says, I really think the best portrait I ever beheld. Nevertheless, despite his appreciation of the king's apartments and art collection, Swinburne is firmly of the opinion that the royal family would have been much better off moving their residence to the Buen Retiro Palace in the east of the city, rather than rebuilding on this cramped but central spot. He admires the Buen Retiro's setting, although he laments its current dilapidated state. Impressed by Carlos's project to modernize the city, he notes the new Gate of Alcalá, a new arch designed by Sabatini, which he describes as rather heavy, and the new Prado, which he says in a few years, provided they manage the trees properly, will be one of the finest walks in the world. He's especially appreciative that the view from this walk is, as it should be, confined. For the winds are so sharp and boisterous and the landscape so horrid all around the city that no place of public resort could be comfortable unless it were, like this, shut in from all distant views. For the next half a century, Swinburne's travels through Spain reappeared under multiple titles, revisions and reeditions, including an abridged coffee table album called Picturesque Tour from Spain, which centred on Swinburne's landscape drawings, like the one behind me. However, the contradictions in Henry Swinburne's vision of Madrid, his struggle to balance the city's functional and aesthetic qualities, and in particular, his reading of the city as a material reflection of Spain's moral and geopolitical decline, would remain familiar pillars in British writing on the city throughout the century that followed. So moving into the 19th century, 60 years after Swinburne, his fellow Brit Richard Ford also visited Madrid and was equally unimpressed with what he found. Ford, for those of you not familiar with him, was a professional expert on Spain, a reviewer, commentator and art critic who was for almost 30 years the London media's first port of call for views on Spain. He and his family actually lived in the country for 3 years between 1830 and 1833. They took rooms at the Alhambra in Granada, where Ford's family stayed while he roamed the country, and he travelled all across Spain on horseback. More than 10 years later, he compiled his recollections of that 3 years of travel into the highly idiosyncratic and incredibly long Handbook for Travellers in Spain and Readers at Home, which was published in 1845 in John Murray's popular handbook series. The rapidly changing landscape for travellers to Madrid during the 1830s and 1840s is highlighted by Ford's postscript to the introduction. It's dated 19th of July, 1845, and he writes, "By arrangements just concluded, Madrid may now be reached in 6 days from London. The peninsular steamer from Southampton arrives at Corunna in about 72 hours, whence the Royal Mail runs to the capital in 3 days and a half, 3.5 days on the train to get from Corunna down to Madrid." Now, Ford's overall attitude towards Spain in this book is imbued with both a deep affection for the country and also an unshakable sense of British superiority. And I've written elsewhere about the way that he frames the country, and especially its southern and eastern parts, in acutely Orientalist terms, viewing it as ripe for British economic investment. However, in writing about Madrid, which Ford considers but a dear, second-rate, inhospitable city, he uses a rather different frame. Whereas, he says, a volume might be written on the vestiges of ancient and oriental manners with which private life in Spain is strewed, at Madrid, by contrast, there is an aping of French and English manners. Now in Madrid and the great cities, as the women have put on French bonnets, the men have taken to English pea jackets, or rather Parisian paletos. As a result, he feels the city lacks the authenticity of its southern and eastern neighbours. He writes, "Madrid will most please those who have hurried directly into Spain from France, for whom the costume, Prado and bullfight will strike with all the charm of novelty and strangeness of contrast, which will be wanting to those who arrive from beautiful Valencia, Moorish Granada, or stately Seville." And it has to be said that Ford's vision of Madrid is largely negative. Compared with what he calls the many time-honoured capitals of Spain, he dismisses Madrid as a modern place. It ranks only as a town, villa, not a city, ciudad. It does not even possess a cathedral. In moments of national danger, it exercises little influence over the peninsula. At the same time, from being the seat of the court and government, the centre of patronage and fashion, it attracts from all parts los pretendientes and those who wish to make their fortunes. In short, he concludes, the capital has a hold on the ambition rather than the affections of the nation at large. In contrast, he observes that Madrid's own inhabitants take a rather different view. He says, "The townspeople think Madrid the envy and admiration of mankind. They talk of it as the capital of Spain, i.e. the world, for quien dice España dice todo. There is but one Madrid, no hay sino un Madrid. Unique like the phoenix, it is the only court on earth. Solo Madrid es corte. Wherever it is mentioned, the world is silent with awe. Donde está Madrid, calle el mundo. There is but one stage from Madrid to La Gloria, or paradise, in which there is a window for angels to look down on this counterpart heaven on earth." Visitors who listen to what he calls grandiloquent exaggerations, however, will indeed be disappointed. For in Ford's opinion, ranked with London or even Liverpool and Edinburgh, everything in Madrid is very second-rate and retail. Now, much of Ford's dislike for Madrid centres on its lack of an organic history. As he says, unlike the many time-honoured capitals of Spain, this is an upstart favourite without merit and a creation of the caprice of Charles V, who made the gross mistake of a position which has no single advantage except the fancied geographical merit of being in the centre of Spain. As an artificially constructed capital, Ford considers Madrid to lack the attachment to its landscape of more organically developed cities. Everything around Madrid, he says, is the abomination of a self-created desolation without recollections or associations. Here, nature and man seem fitted for each other, for the denuded environs only evince a bad soil and a worse cultivation. nor is there to be any escape into pleasant suburbs. For the immediate environs of Madrid offer small attraction, as the city of pride and pretension stands alone in its desert solitude. This association of Madrid with lacking, with emptiness, is reflected also in Ford's assessment of its economic role in Spain's development. In economic terms, Ford envisages the city as, I quote, a spider in the center of its web. It's a black hole at Spain's center, which, producing and supplying nothing, consumes everything, like an exhausting receiver. It is, he says, a city without industry or resources, and poorer than many of our provincial cities. All this being said, Ford does recognise that a new Madrid has begun to emerge since the death of Fernando VII in 1833, since when, he said, it has been so much improved as a town that Spaniards who have recently returned there scarcely know it again. There is more life and movement in the streets, some of which are better cleaned, paved and lighted. The destruction of convents has opened spaces, and new buildings are erecting everywhere. This ongoing transformation, however, is not straightforward, for Ford notes how the instability of post-Fernandine Spanish politics is reflected in the city's street map, where, he says, many of the old names have been changed for democratic and patriotic appellations. These, however, as parties upset each other, are once again rechanged, and being liable to alterations at every shift of the political scene, we should adopt the original nomenclature, with which, after all, the people are best acquainted. As far as visitors to Madrid are concerned, Ford notes that there have been some improvements, not only in transport routes, as he observed in that breaking news postscript I mentioned earlier, but also in accommodation. He said, the hotels until lately were among the very worst in Europe, but the number of new coach companies, by bringing in more travellers, has created a demand for better accommodation. Some of these companies have set up inns or paradores of their own, which many cafes and tolerable restaurants have been established, principally by foreigners, as occurs in the East. Despite these improvements, however, Ford does not recommend visitors spend more than a few days in Madrid. For, he says, few foreigners enjoy much health of mind or body in this unsocial, insalubrious city, which is, morally and physically considered, a city in which a lengthened residence withers mind and body. For Ford, in short, Madrid is a town where climate and policy alike conspire to put out life and mind. Now, despite his evident dislike for Madrid, Ford was acutely aware of its importance to British travellers. So I talked earlier about how in the 1845 edition of the handbook, he added that last-minute postscript, emphasising the city could now be reached from London in just 6 days. And he was obviously had a keen eye for emerging infrastructure projects. Elsewhere in the handbook, he describes the current plans by British companies for 4 new railway lines from Madrid to Barcelona, Cádiz, Badajoz, and the northern port of Avilés. And he devotes a great deal of attention to the Avilés project, which at the time he was writing in 1845 had just been floated on the London Stock Exchange, and which, if successful, would, according to Ford, bring Madrid, the so long isolated central capital of Spain, within 4 days' journey of London, the capital of the world, the stronghold of peace, order, and liberty, the fountain of moral civilization. These, he says, are gifts worthy of the ocean's queen, and which must inevitably influence, in an incalculable degree, the future progress of Spain to new wealth, honour, power, and prosperity. However, the project was stalled by the investigations of the British engineer, George Stephenson, who formed an unfavourable opinion of the project and considered that the traffic would not amount to 1/8 of the estimate. Whether or not, as a direct consequence of Stephenson's hesitancy, the Avilés project, as the third 1855 edition of the handbook briefly noted, ended in smoke, and Madrid's 4-day connection with the fountain of modern civilization would have to wait. Now, of course, the railways did eventually come to Spain, if not immediately to Avilés. During the 1850s and 1860s, an extensive nationwide railway network was constructed, with Madrid at its heart. Ford's spider continued to lurk at the heart of her web. In 1863 and 1864, respectively, railway lines reached the Portuguese and French borders, the latter allowing British travellers easy overland access to Spain via Paris. Within a year, 2 new publications had brought British travellers to Spain into the railway age. One was Bradshaw's Illustrated Handbook to Spain and Portugal, and the other was O'Shea's Guide to Spain and Portugal. Both of them were published for the first time in 1865, and both of them survived in successive editions until the turn of the 20th century. Madrid's position at the heart of Spain's rail network meant that the city became an important, if not always well-loved, point on the emerging British tourist map of the country, and the guides reflect this. So my favourite one of the two is O'Shea's Guide, so that's the one I'm going to talk to you about now. It was written by a chap called Henry O'Shea, who was a member of an old Hispano-Irish family. He'd been born in Madrid, but by the time he wrote the guide, he was a French citizen living across the border in Biarritz. His extensive first-hand knowledge of Madrid and its people comes across clearly in his guide, as does his determination, perhaps as a counterpoint to Richard Ford, to present the city's best side. Writing 20 years after Ford, and with a similarly idiosyncratic, although much less scornful tone, O'Shea is able to appreciate the effects of the modernisation his predecessor had only just begun to observe. Notwithstanding the most unfavourable circumstances that can check the prosperity of a metropolis, he says, including a great elevation, an almost waterless river, an arid, sandy soil, an isolated situation amid treeless and wind-blown plains, to which may be added the neglect of government, the paralysation of private enterprise, and other disastrous effects with which continued political disturbances are usually attended. The city has now fairly entered the path of progress and bids fair to become shortly one of the handsomest and most prosperous capitals of Europe. The problems of isolation and lack of industry that Ford observed in Madrid have been transformed now by the development of the railways, where, O'Shea writes, Madrid has been made the axis of a wheel from which the many main lines diverge like spokes that reach to the extremities of the kingdom. And by this means, all the necessaries and luxuries of life, whether imported from the provinces or from abroad, are now obtained in greater abundance and at lower prices than before. O'Shea's Guide also consolidates very practical information for the city's growing number of visitors. And he has an extensive catalogue, pages and pages of the sites to be seen and the institutions to be visited in the city. He devotes special attention to the Royal Palace and the Prado, where he provides his readers with a detailed list of holdings, notes for interpretation, and maps to help navigate the various rooms. Perhaps working from personal knowledge, he also includes details of dozens of private collections and libraries. So, for example, the bibliotecas of the Duke de Osuna applied to his apoderado general, the Duke de Medinaceli applied to his administrador, and the Duke of Veraguas, where visitors were encouraged to apply personally to the Duke. And O'Shea also unusually encourages visitors to apply for tickets to the Tribuna Pública of the Congreso or House of Commons, noting that the speakers most worth hearing are Messieurs Olezaga, Pacheco, Aparicio Guijarro, González Bravo, etc. Their eloquence is flowery, elegant, graphic, racy, very Eastern, diffuse, seldom to the point, personal, recriminatory, and thoughts, often richly laden, float with wings expanded by imagination upon a sea of words, and too often sink. Despite his enthusiasm for Spain's very Eastern political rhetoric, O'Shea echoes Swinburne and Ford in seeing Madrid as a less than authentically Spanish city and a material reflection of Spain's historical and geopolitical decline. As to the general appearance of Madrid, he says, we may state that it has little or nothing Spanish about it. There are no vestiges of the Moorish, medieval, or brilliant periods of Spanish art, no cathedral, strange to say, nor churches containing objects of art to interest the tourist. And the few monuments and public edifices that exist were erected in a period of decadence, when the Churrigueresque and Rococo were all the fashion, and marked the likewise fallen spirit of the age and court. Again, like Ford, O'Shea locates Madrid's lack of authenticity in its emulation of Paris and Parisian fashion, not only in its urban design, but in the appearance of its people, where he says elements of Spanishness must be sought out. For though the population has a European character in its dress, some picturesque costumes may yet be seen here and there, and the mantilla and cloak have not altogether disappeared before the invading French bonnet. Nonetheless, he's keen that visitors should come to the city with clear eyes, and he warns that society in manner, dress, etc., is here what it is in London or Paris, and we must lay aside antiquated notions and romantic impressions which may have been acquired from recollections of Il Barbiere di Sevilla in London. Right. As the century wore on, the ongoing transport revolution brought Madrid ever closer to Britain. While the journey from London took 6 days in 1845 and 4 days in 1869, by 1901, travellers could make the journey in less than 2 days, depending on the speed of the train they chose. Partly as a function of its central position in Spain's railway network, Madrid was always featured as a stop on the rapidly proliferating holiday tours organised by companies such as Cook's, who by the turn of the century were leaving London for Spain several times a year, and they generally followed a semicircular route. So they entered Spain at the French border at Irún, then travelled south via Madrid and Andalusia to Barcelona, and then back via southern France. If travellers generally agreed with Ford and O'Shea that Madrid couldn't compete with its southern neighbours in terms of exoticism or architecture, they were always keen to experience its museums and galleries, and especially the Prado. As Aubrey Fitzgerald Bell observed in 1912, however rapid and conventional, a journey that includes the Alhambra, the Mosque of Cordoba, the cathedrals of Seville, Toledo and Burgos, and the picture galleries of Seville and Madrid can scarcely be said to have been in vain. So now we've reached the 20th century. And early in the 20th century, with its railway stations and picture galleries firmly established on tourist itineraries, some British friends of Madrid began to encourage their fellow Brits to look more closely at the Spanish capital. And a clear salvo in the bid to claim Madrid as a modern city fit for discerning British visitors came in 1909 with the publication of Albert Frederick Calvert's Madrid, an historical description and handbook of the Spanish capital with 453 illustrations. Now, Calvert, you may have come across before. He was one of the most prolific authors on Spain during the first decade of the 20th century. And his book on Madrid was part of his ongoing Spanish series of lavishly illustrated volumes, which were generally on Spain's cities, Spanish artists, and Spanish museums. And we can get a flavour of his bombastic style from his opening statement. Developed seriously in the 16th century, is but a nursling among the cities of Spain. However, his work had a serious aim. He states in the preface that his objective is, above all, to dissipate many of the erroneous and defamatory impressions that are current with regard to the Spanish capital, and in particular to challenge the undeserved strictures that have been passed upon the city by captious and prejudiced critics. And I can only think he's thinking of Richard Ford and his followers here. For, he says, Madrid is a city of broad thoroughfares, magnificent public buildings and handsome houses. And since it has been rescued from its geographical remoteness by being made the centre of the Spanish railway system, it's become one of the most accessible and prosperous capitals of Europe. Like his predecessors, Calvert initially frames his vision of Madrid by pronouncing what the city lacks. It doesn't have a good position nor comfortable weather. It lacks the dignity and beauty which a wide river lends to a city, and it has very little to show in the nature of antiquities. Nonetheless, he says, it has been the site of days of immense moment in the history of Spain, and it is moreover one of the handsomest towns in the Europe of today. As Spain's capital, Madrid is home to a series of national institutions where the country's achievements can be acknowledged. Calvert draws his readers' attention to the city's Real Academia de Bellas Artes and the academies of history, science, and medicine. The Naval Museum, that he says recalls the past maritime supremacy of Spain, the National Library with nearly 1 million books, and the National Museum of Archaeology. Like visitors going all the way back to Swinburne 130 years earlier, Calvert also highlights the city's fine arts, including a priceless collection of some of the world's masterpieces of painting, a royal armoury that is the finest in the world, the Museum of Modern Arts, and the Prado Gallery, which he calls the greatest glory of Madrid. Like Ford and O'Shea before him, Calvert sees Madrid as a city in the throes of modernisation. Old Madrid, according to Calvert, is rapidly disappearing. The old alleys and small squares around its geographical centre in the Puerta del Sol have been replaced by a new commercial streetscape, the Piccadilly Circus of Madrid, where American and English tourists mingle with the throng and German commercial travellers talk business with their customers on the seats outside the cafes. Calvert harks back to the British missionary George Borrow in his residence near the Puerta del Sol some 70 years earlier. Disagreeing with Borrow's assertion of Madrid as essentially Spanish, which Calvert suggests, is true only if we have regard for the fact that the metropolis of Spain has still a character of its own, and in many respects more European and modern than Seville, Cadiz, Malaga, and Granada. Agreeing with Swinburne 130 years earlier, Calvert notes that in Cordova and Toledo, we are reminded at every step of the influence of the Morisco. But in Madrid, we recall the Spain of Charles V and of the Bourbons. Despite, or perhaps because of its cosmopolitanism, Calvert argues that rather than French influence Barcelona, it is from Madrid that one may expect the impetus of a patriotic, national and racial advancement based upon culture and the recognition of the principles of social liberty. So one of the surprises awaiting Calvert's readers and other Edwardian visitors to Madrid was the extent of the infrastructure that had grown up to welcome the British travellers who'd arrived and multiplied along with the railways. The iconic Baedeker Guide to Spain, first published in 1898, records a whole raft of English facilities for tourists who preferred the comforts of home, such as the well-spoken of pension briggs in Calle Luzon, the Cervecería Inglesa, or English refreshment bar in Calle Echegaray, which provided thirsty travellers with English and German draft beers, the home for English and German governesses in Calle Bravo Murillo, and the English church, presided over by the Reverend F. Bullock Webster at 1 Calle de Ferraz. Such ubiquity of English, and English is the term he uses rather than British, English services and institutions did not meet with universal approval. In an earlier book of his, Impressions of Spain, published in 1903, Calvert recounts with amusement the dismayed response of an American writer who did Spain in the customary slapdash, get there and get away again fashion of American globetrotters, and discovered that in Madrid, English goods, English manners, and English influence predominates over those of any other foreign nation. Obviously, the presence of British culture in Madrid was intensified by the Anglo-Spanish royal wedding of 1906, when Spain's King Alfonso married Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Anna. This was especially visible in the social sphere, where a shift was observed by some to be taking place from French to British influence. And one local newspaper, British local newspaper, the Cheltenham Looker-On, did quite an extensive article about this in the context of the royal wedding. And they wrote that while old-fashioned people still cherishing doubts of the propriety of English customs accept those of France as correct, the younger generation embraces the example of Alfonso with his motor cars, sport, and bicycles. Ever since Alfonso swept down into Biarritz and asserted his rights to walk out with his princess, to drive her in motor cars, to play at golf and tennis, there has arisen a demand for not only golf clubs, but tennis courts at Madrid. And the poor little insufficient court within the walls of the Hippodrome has a list of more than 100 members of the great titled families crying out for better accommodation. So, as we've seen, one of the primary threads running through British visions of Madrid from Swinburne onwards, and likely from earlier, is the dissonance between old and modern Madrid. Tourists everywhere have long struggled, of course, to reconcile the yearning to see what is authentic and unchanging about a place with the desire for comfortable lodgings and speedy transport. And of course, every time and place constructs a distinction between ancient and modern in its own distinctive way. In Victorian and Edwardian popular culture, the idea of Old Madrid carried a particular charge. In Old Madrid was the title of a popular ballad, a musical play, and even a 1911 short film starring Mary Pickford, albeit the film was actually filmed in Cuba, not in Madrid at all. The ballad was first published in 1889. It was very widely performed and so popular it's even mentioned in James Joyce's Ulysses 30 years later. Quote, "Would give anything to be back in Gib and hear you sing Waiting and in Old Madrid." It's a sentimental song of forbidden love, drawing on familiar markers of orientalized Spanishness. You'll be very relieved to hear I'm not going to sing it for you, but I will just read you the first verse. Long years ago in old Madrid, where softly sighs of love the light guitar, two sparkling eyes a lattice hid, two eyes as darkly bright as love's own star. And inevitably, the owners of the guitar and the sparkling eyes are kept apart, first by a river and eventually by death. He falls in battle, she joins a convent, but every night she listens at the latticed window for her lover's song. The Madrid of the ballad, as of the musical and the short film that followed, is not really Madrid at all, of course, but a placeholder for a romantic, orientalized vision of a generically Spanish place, where star-crossed lovers are kept apart by the latticed windows that could belong as much to an Andalusian or even Arab townhouse as to a Castilian convent. The ubiquitous romantic notion of old Madrid was doubtless a contributing factor in the confusion of British visitors to Madrid. They often struggled to reconcile the much vaunted eternal Spain with the bustling cosmopolitan city before them. Sybil Fitzgerald, who tellingly titled her 1905 memoir of travel through southern Spain and North Africa In the Track of the Moors, found that the easiest way to deal with any lingering confusion was to place Madrid firmly on the side of the modern. Flying through the Castilian countryside, as she said, as the Paris Express rushes to Madrid, Fitzgerald notes that now that Carlism lies dead, there seems every chance of Spain becoming as centralized in Madrid as France is in Paris, or as Italy is not in Rome. We hear so much, she says, of the wonderful advances made in Spain during the last 15 or 20 years, both in culture and enlightenment. As her title reveals in The Track of the Moors, of course, it's not modern enlightened Spain that Fitzgerald has in her sights. And so on the very first page of her book, she performs a canny maneuver. She explicitly locates Spain's 20th century in Madrid, the most modern town in the world. And then she swiftly leaves both city and century behind as she journeys south. Albert Calvert, too, writing 4 years after Fitzgerald, was evidently familiar with Britain too. The city sits firmly on the side of the modern. He says, it manifests the modern spirit in Spain rather than the medieval atmospheres. It does not live upon its past like Cordova and Toledo. The streets are broad, the system of lighting is modern, there are electric tramcars, motor cars, and London and Parisian vehicles in the thoroughfares. However, although the city emulates Paris in some of its design, Madrid has an aspect and a character of its own. Despite the tram cars, the modern air of the streets, and the London and Parisian fashions in dress, you cannot fail to realise that this is a Spanish city. Writing around the same time as Fitzgerald and Calvert, Letitia Higgin takes an entirely contrasting and I think much more interesting approach to that tension between old and modern Madrid. So where both Fitzgerald and Calvert saw Madrid as a modern exception in a land dominated by its past, Higgin, in contrast, sought to demonstrate how the two can't be separated. So who was Higgin? Well, her name was Letitia. Letitia Higgin, known as Lily, was the author as L. Higgin of the popular 1902 book Spanish Life in Town and Country. But between 1904 and 1911, she also contributed a number of weighty articles on Spain to the Fortnightly Review. And Higgin's writing shows firm evidence of her deep knowledge of Spanish literature, history and politics, and a keen awareness of Spanish commerce and current affairs. She was a really interesting lady who deserves to be much better remembered than she was. So the article I'm interested in was published in the Fortnightly Review in 1904. It's called Spain, Yesterday and Today. And what the article is really is the germ of a project to construct a genealogy of memory that stretches from Higgin's personal experience of the revolutionary Madrid of the 1860s and 1870s, where she lived as a young woman, through her conversations with elderly British expats back into the equally volatile 1830s. With her own she tells readers, "My personal acquaintance with Spain goes back to the days before the Northern Railway was finished, and the journey from France was made by diligence between Bayonne and Pamplona. Perhaps," she says, "this exciting experience, perched in the high coupe with a team of mules, always at full gallop, tearing up and down hill alike through the precipitous passes, perhaps that excitement carried one through the bare plains of the central tableland with an equanimity which is wanting to the prosaic railway traveller of today." Higgin draws a vivid picture of the colourful, noisy streets of past Madrid, ill paved, she says, but filled day and night by a motley and picturesque throng, all talking, gesticulating, singing in their infinitely varied and picturesque costumes. Altogether, she says, Madrid, when she came to know it, was a scene of colour, light, gaiety and movement in the brilliant Spanish sun, perhaps scarcely to be seen elsewhere, and which has almost vanished from the streets of the cosmopolitan Madrid of today. But Higgin's memories are not entirely rose-tinted. In strong contrast with all this gaiety and colour, she writes, went the most extraordinary squalor. The unfinished palace with its shabby entrance court unencumbered with rubbish, the plaster lions in front of the Congreso de los Diputados, showing the ravages of many a street ball, plaster peeling unabashed off the public buildings and the palaces of the grandees, while from the upper windows of the last fluttered the weekly wash of evident poverty. The churches, she said, were no better. There was not one that would compare with a third-rate building for the service of religion in any small town in France or Italy. Internally, they were dirty, tawdry, and miserable. However, drawing on conversations with an English officer of 1833 who had elected to make his home in Spain, Higgin understands that even in the times she's just described, things had improved and made considerable progress from the time of Fernando VII. She says, "It had been a mere mass of grim, blank walls with nunnery windows and iron-sheeted doors. Where the Hotel de Paris now stands in 1904, at the corner of the Puerta del Sol, even in my day stood the remains of one of these dismal old monasteries." Through her conceit of layering her own and others' recollections of the city's past, Higgin excavates the familiar sites and monuments to reveal the layers of history and dirt that challenge the popular beliefs about Spain then in circulation in early 20th century Britain. For as she writes, everyone goes to Spain nowadays, and almost everyone writes a book about it the moment he or she comes back. Higgin's intention in drawing this vivid picture of past Madrid is to create a context for the modern Madrid, as she captions one of the photographs in Spanish Life, seen by the Cook's tourists. Like other British writers on Madrid, Higgins sees a city constantly, eternally in the process of progress. Cosmopolitan Madrid as it exists today, she writes, is too well known to the ordinary tourist need mention. If it has lost much of the old picturesqueness and strangeness, it has gained immensely in beauty and fitness. Few, if any, capitals contain more really handsome buildings, finer parks, drives, and public gardens. A whole new city has arisen outside the old boundaries. The plaster decorations have given place to stone and marble, and the statues which so plentifully adorn its plazas are almost all works of art and worthy of their position. Having enthusiastically detailed this transformation, which she says is as visible in Madrid's society and economy as on its streets, Higgin expresses her frustration at the insistence of her fellow Britons on seeing Madrid as a city stuck in the past, encapsulates in what she calls the foolish parrot cry of the Cook's tourist of today that nothing ever changes in Spain. Higgin herself, in contrast, is inherently optimistic about Spain's future. A common thread in all of her writing is that far from the backward, quasi-medieval country of the Romantic imagination, Spain is a thriving modern society with a thriving modern economy, and Madrid is its thriving modern capital, albeit one whose past is woven inextricably into its streets and buildings. So to wrap up, as I hope I've shown you today, Madrid has long been something of a puzzle for British travellers, especially those mesmerised by romantic notions of eternal, exotic, unchanging Spain. The accounts we've seen are inevitably shaped by the specificities of the context within which they were written. From the cynicism of Swinburne and Ford, through the cheery boosterism of O'Shea and Calvert, to Higgin's evocative layering of past and present. However, one thing they all share is a fundamental vision of Madrid as a city in constant transformation, where the effects of modernisation are both under your feet and before your eyes. And crucially, Madrid's function as both a real-life city and a metonym for the Spanish government allows writers in very different contexts to draw a connection between the futures of city and country, as they propose a new British vision of Spain, not as the isolated, unchanging territory of the Romantics, but as a modern, hyper-connected country where the process of progress is endlessly in play. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. It was really fantastic. I have been living in Madrid before I joined Cervantes for 15 years, and I have learned so much, even being for such a long time in Madrid. Thank you. It was really great. And now the floor is open to your questions. If you want, you can write down in the chat, or even you can open your microphones and ask Professor Hooper if you have some questions or comments to make about the lecture. While waiting for the questions, maybe there might be also in the 19th century some women, no, British women traveling in Spain. We know from the last lecture in Galicia was very, very obvious. But what about Madrid? Is this somebody who might have, you know, another vision of the city from another perspective?
That's a really great question. Certainly by the end of the century, there were lots, perhaps even more British women writing about Spain than men. But okay, during the 19th century, I think fewer. And I think that they weren't all publishing their accounts in sort of the, you know, the handbook. So what I was looking at was really the formal handbooks, the Ford and the O'Shea, and women certainly weren't publishing in that format. But I think that if we were to look through memoirs and correspondence and perhaps even art, we would find much more evidence of women travelers in Madrid. But I can't name any for you right now.
No. It's just, no, but it's good to know that there were even more women at a certain time than men writing about Madrid. So that proves that this development with Thomas Cook and the connection with the railway to London, Madrid, that is something also that I have learned so much about Madrid in this lecture. Thank you. So the public are very interested, but rather shy tonight. If there is not any comments or questions more, we leave it here now. And thank you again to all of you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Kirsty Hooper, fantastic. We are looking forward very much for your next lecture about the Basque Country from the perspective of the British travelers in Spain. And since it is the last lecture of this series this year, although we are almost 1 month in the Christmas, but happy Christmas to everybody. And yes, enjoy your time. Yes, there is a comment from Linda Lewandowski. When will the Basque lecture be given? We will inform you about the date, hopefully in January or even at the end before Christmas. But we will definitely also send an email to all of you informing about the next lecture about the Basque Country. Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. Buenas noches.
Thank you. Bye-bye.